Hello again, it's Jailhouse Moose. I'm gonna go on to podcast number 3. I'm gonna just warn everyone now that this podcast may be triggering for some people. I'm not going to speak about the specifics of my offence. I'm not going to name names and dates and everything like that. However, I did murder my partner. Um, it was a cowardly and cruel assault, and I'm going to speak about the kind of how I could justify and minimize and rationalize the toxic and abusive behaviors and remaining in an abusive relationship. So, some of the things I speak about may be triggering for some people, so I just want you to be forewarned about that and to use your own discretion. The blog I'll be reading from today was entitled Pleading Guilty is Not Taking Responsibility. So if you wanted to, you could go to www.wordpress.com/jailhousemoose or jailhousemoose.wordpress.com, and you will find the blog there. It might be easier to read it because you can kind of go as far as you want. Of course, you can stop at any time with this podcast as well. This is about my ability to when the scales were kind of pulled back from my eyes at that moment midway around through my sentence, where I started to really pull myself apart and look at the triggers for my offence. When I went to prison, I admitted I had killed my partner, and then I went through the judicial process, and I knew I was going to be spending a number of years in prison. I didn't know if I was going to be serving a sentence for murder or manslaughter at that time. In the end, I pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced, and I got my tariff I was going to spend. In the initial days, I thought I pled guilty, so that's it, I've taken responsibility. And I busied myself with other people's problems. I was a listener trained by the Samaritans, so I supported other prisoners in crisis. I was an insider, I was a peer mentor. I helped prisoners all day, every day, and I thought I was doing a good thing, and what I was really doing was deflecting and not looking internally. I was busying myself with other people's problems so I didn't have to deal with mine. And I did that for a few years until I went through the prison system, and I started getting involved in the offender behavioural programs, the CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, particularly the healthy relationships program. I'm not sure if it still runs now, and it was a high intensity program. It ran for about 6 months, and it was 4 days a week for 3 hours a day of group sessions, and then there was intensive one-to-one sessions with a particular course handler or facilitator or a forensic psychologist. And there were no punches pulled with that program. We started with 10. I think we finished with 7. 3 guys dropped out of it. But it was something that I very much embraced and threw myself into. And it was where I met one of my best mates, Miley. And we were paired up to do a role play in HRP. But it was, as we were about to start, a lot of people were grumbling, going, "Oh, fuck this is bollocks, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to feel like an idiot. I'm not going to pretend he's my girlfriend. I'm not going to pretend this. I'm not going to pretend the other." And I just looked at Miley and I said, "Listen, mate, I am going all in on this thing, all in. So don't you fuck around on me." And he just looked at me and said, "Okay, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's go all in." And we did, and we really pushed each other. And to this day, he's somebody I speak to. One of the 4 people I met in my prison in over a decade that I stay in touch with, and we are so aligned in our values, and we check in with each other, and we talk about the joy of being able to communicate, the joy of being able to manage our emotions. We watch things like Married at First Sight and look at those toxic behaviours, and they're alarming and make us uncomfortable, because we used to be those guys. We used to do these things, the gaslighting and everything else, but we did not know at the time. That does not justify or minimise the fact that I murdered somebody in any way, shape or form. But this is what the topic of this particular blog is about. So what I'm going to do now is read the actual blog, which was published back in March of 21. Wow, but it's based on events that happened way, way, way before that, and on the behavioural courses that I did in around 2016 as well. So, as I said, be warned, it may be a little bit triggering. It's not going to be easy. It's probably not going to be easy for me as well, but I'll explain afterwards why I think it is essential that I speak about these things, and what my intentions with this podcast, with the blog, have been, and where I'm going forwards. So, pleading guilty is not taking responsibility. I had admitted to killing my partner when I was arrested, and I was remanded in custody while awaiting the judicial process. When I went to court, I had two options. I could plead guilty to murder or guilty to manslaughter. If I chose the latter option, manslaughter, it would trigger a trial and would be up to a jury to decide which conviction I would receive. Now, my legal team urged me to plead manslaughter and run a trial. They assured me that I had a strong case. But in a time of legal aid cutbacks, I believe that they were primarily concerned with the fees that they could charge during a murder trial. They didn't care about me or my victim's family. At that time, I knew that I could at least not make things worse. I pleaded guilty. I was taking responsibility for my crime. Around 2 weeks after my conviction, I met with my first offender supervisor. This was the man that would start me on the rehabilitative part of my incarceration. He interviewed me at length, asking me about my life, my history, my relationships, the build-up to and the day of my offence. Towards the end of the interview, he mentioned the guilty plea at court, and I described how it gave me some comfort having taken responsibility for my crime. I was confused when he told me that he believed that my guilty plea was well motivated, but I was still far from taking responsibility. I mean, I was confused. Was this guy an idiot? It has taken over a decade of imprisonment and behavioural work to appreciate that he was absolutely right. It's taken around 1,000 hours of intensive group and individual cognitive behavioural therapy sessions, thousands more hours of self-reflecting to shed the justifications that I still held on to. When I read Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed, it resonated with me. I think this has been the motivation for me to start writing about the nature of my crime. Syed suggests that mistakes in life should be examined forensically to determine their cause and to gain the knowledge necessary to prevent the same things happening again. Where people have a tendency to deny their mistakes, or that they have happened, or to diminish the significance of their contributions, a learning opportunity has been missed. I am not suggesting that I am in any way unashamed of my crime, but I've tried to identify how I could allow myself to fall into a situation where I killed somebody that I loved. I needed to know that there was a cause, and that I wasn't just fundamentally damaged. I was fearful that I had some form of Incredible Hulk gene. Was it only a matter of time before I exploded into a fit of violent rage again? The truth of the matter was my crime stemmed from an inability or unwillingness to face my problems and manage my emotions. I was every classic abusive cliche. I may as well have started every sentence with, "I'm not an abusive man, but..." When I committed my crime, I had been provoked, and was drunk, and was under great emotional stress, and had financial worries, and she knew what she was doing, and she wouldn't have been able to cope without me, and the list went on and on. Through the CBT process, I worked with great facilitators and psychologists, and gradually I let go of the excuses. During one session where we discussed an autobiography I had written, the psychologist described my progress as encouraging. She suggested that I had progressed from dipping my toes in the responsibility pool to walking in the water with my trousers rolled up. She told me it was just time to just jump into the pool and gave me some suggestions on how I could progress further. I revisited my autobiography, and this time I wrote it from a third-person perspective, as if I were watching events through a CCTV camera, with no way of knowing what the people on screen were thinking or what their motivations were. This painful process produced a version both shorter and profoundly different. I took away all of the excuses, stripped back the justifications, and I finally understood. I had been violent, cruel, abusive, and cowardly. I murdered an innocent woman. It's not easy to think about the worst things that I have done in my life, let alone to write them down in a simple sentence without any embellishment or mitigation. But there is great power in the use of a reductive statement, a tool I still use regularly to check in on myself. When things don't go as expected, or could have gone better, I try to examine events dispassionately, like air crash investigators who recover the black box and piece the wreckage back together. When I reflect on things, I examine the observables, focusing purely on what happened. I forget about the thought processes I used or the intentions that I may have had. I certainly don't guess at the motivations or thought processes of the other parties. It has made me focus on my behaviours and how they impact on other people. By knowing that I will take full responsibility for my actions, I've become far more considered in the things that I say or do. While I hate the man that I have been, I finally accepted that I was that man. I am aware that I still have the potential to cause harm, but knowing that makes me vigilant. Mine are lessons that have come at too high a price not to be cherished and shared. Now that's the end of the blog, and it's of all the blogs I've written and all the reflection I've done, that one I remember very, very clearly because it was a key moment in my life, not just in my sentence. It was one of those things I've seen time and time again and still see now. When somebody says something that's coarse, and then they say, oh, it's just banter. When somebody says something that's offensive to somebody, and when that other person takes offence, they go, oh, I didn't mean it, it's only banter, I was only having a laugh, you shouldn't take offence. Well, the simple fact of the matter is, as soon as I have said words, or sent a text, or written an email, or put a post up somewhere, my intention is gone. What my motivation was is gone. It's an element, it has its own life, it has its own entity, and it's out there in the world. Now, if somebody else takes offence at what I've said or done, I have to accept that what I'd said or did was offensive to that person. Similarly, if somebody feels that what I said or did was abusive, I have to accept unequivocally that what I did or said was abusive. My intentions don't come into it. And it's made me very much more deliberate and very much more mindful about what I do. And I think I've embraced Sikh faith. I wear an iron bangle on my wrist. It's called a kara, and it rattles around there, and it's a constant reminder of my actions and that the things that I do, I am going to be accountable for. So I need to just take a beat and think about it. Is what I'm doing something that I'm going to feel shame for, or regret about, or have to repent for? And if it is, I shouldn't be doing it. And to say, I cannot be blind to it. I cannot justify it and say, well, other people would, or I'm provoked, or I'm angry. That is not an excuse for being abusive or offensive or threatening or hurtful or cruel or manipulative. So something I think very much on. And responsibility, I think, is the key thing. Responsibility and remorse are two things that were key for parole boards in deciding. And I'll say that in my years in prison and the tens of thousands of men that I met in prisons, there was a broad distinction that could be drawn between those who regretted what they had done and those who didn't. Those who regretted what they had done, like me, who I bitterly regret everything I've done, would accept that there was something fundamentally wrong and therefore something that needed to be changed. Whereas those who did not regret would just carry on doing what they were doing. And I think it was to say, when you came into prison, you could regret what you had done or regret being caught. And there were plenty of guys who merely regretted being caught and planned for the day that they would get through the sentence, They would get back out again and they would do the same thing, except they would do it smarter, they'd be more forensically aware, and they wouldn't get caught the next time. And these were the guys I could see on repeat occasions coming in and out of the system. They could get sentences in weeks or years or months. They would get out, they would do the same thing and come back in again, and there was no will to change, there was no drive to change. Whereas for me, early days, I landed in prison and realised I was a broken human. There was a reason I was being removed from society, because I was not fit to function as a member of society. I was a drain on society. I was a cancer in society, and I did need to be taken out of it. And through that process, and through the support of people like the offender managers and other prisoners, when they spoke, and they didn't tell me what to do, but they shared their experiences, and those people, I think, were the ones that helped me to look at it. And I passed on that experience to a lot of other people as well, about being able to take responsibility. Because I think for me, a lot of the shameful things I had done over the years, and they were fucking plenty of things, a lot of those things were lurking, and I dared not look at them. And I think that's where I would use alcohol, I would use cannabis, I would use distraction in order to bury those things away and to not have to look at them and examine them. And I would liken it to being, at one point, something, I had a house when I lived down in London, and there was a giant monster scratching around on the roof one night. Now it turned out to be a squirrel, but when I heard the squirrel scratching around upstairs, the sound of it made it seem like it was a giant monster at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now for me, the deeds and the misdeeds of my past were like monsters that were hiding under my bed, and they were terrifying, and I dared not look at them. But when I eventually tore back the covers and looked underneath the bed and faced them, I realised that the only way that they could hurt me was if I let them hurt me. They were in my past, and if I chose to look at them and accept them, I could resolve with them and apply that process, that black box thinking that I spoke about with Matthew Syed, and say, okay, what happened and why did it happen? And I think I realised, again, this is not me shirking responsibility for my offence. I murdered an innocent woman. That's a reductive statement. That was me. But the way I could do that was because of behaviours that I had learned and I'd been exposed to throughout my childhood, throughout exposure to media, through everything else. My inability to cope emotionally, being a narcissist and being a people pleaser. These were all triggering events. And once I started looking at all of these mistakes dispassionately, I could identify the triggers, and I could start to go back and look at the beliefs that were supporting those behaviours and challenge those beliefs and identify new beliefs. And then realise, and this is to the cognitive behavioural therapy programming, to turn around and say, okay, when this incident happened, when this flare up, when this high risk situation occurred, this is what I thought and this is how I reacted. What will I do now next time I'm in a situation like that? And I think perhaps the greatest vindication for the behavioural therapy programs, and when a lot of people give them all sorts of abuse and say they're a waste of time and they're a waste of money, I think they've been absolutely fantastic. I think they should be taught in schools. The healthy relationships programs, communication skills, conflict resolution, all of these things, they are absolutely brilliant and they absolutely work. Miley and I still speak about HRP today and how it has changed our lives. There are people who will go onto those programs because they are mandated to, who will not engage with the programs, who will be distracting and who will just scratch through the program and will not implement any of the changes or any of the tools there. And I think that's the problem, is looking for the people who are motivated to change and supporting them. But for me, those programs gave me the skills that I am using now still to this day. in my work, when I've worked as a manager, the way I communicate with people, the way I understand what people want, that has been completely transformed because of the ability to listen, to understand, and to know I need to make a decision that I'm going to be accountable for. But in the subject of healthy relationship program, and beliefs and challenging them, there was one thing which was thinking errors. I'm actually going to jump onto another blog now, and I'm just going to read through that, because it related to that thing where you have a flawed belief that you use to sustain a poor behaviour. So this is thinking errors. When it is finally my time to sit in front of a parole board, I'll be asked a number of deep probing questions to determine if I can be safely managed in the community. I will be judged based on my criminal record, my general conduct in prison, and how well I have addressed my offending behaviours. Early on in my sentence, my first offender supervisor offered me some sage counsel. He told me that being a model prisoner was not enough in itself to secure progression. The parole board might very well compliment me on staying out of trouble throughout my sentence, but when they ask, what would be different if we granted you parole and you found yourself in a similar situation, what would be different this time? Well, I would have no answer for them, unless I made some drastic changes to my life. The means to make and to demonstrate changes is through offending behavioural programs. These programs or interventions are usually run by psychology teams in certain prisons. They can be group-based, one-to-one, or most often are a combination of the two. They can last for weeks or months and are often highly charged and emotive sessions. One of the high-intensity programs I undertook lasted for over 5 months, and in total I clocked up in excess of 350 hours of single or group sessions before the program was completed. I don't think anybody likes these programs. One exercise involved each of us writing an autobiography, which was read out in front of 9 other prisoners, 2 therapists and facilitators, and before the group delivered feedback. It's never nice to realise that long-held beliefs have been flawed. All my years of excuses, my rationalising, blame shifting and minimising were exposed, and suddenly something remarkable happened. I finally began to accept total responsibility for my life and my actions, for my crime and for so much more besides. You know the old cliches, I'm not a racist but, I'm not judgmental but. In my case the but was about qualifying my admissions. I never meant to offend anybody but. I spend most days in recovery now trying to stay clean of the but. This is all being brought back to mind by ongoing lockdown here in prison. Some of the lads are getting a little bit tetchier than usual. The more concentrated confinement is exacerbating pre-existing tensions. I generally don't get involved. It's a bit of a playground for me with shifting allegiances and interchangeable best friends. However, I've been overhearing some comments which are textbook examples of the thinking errors that I learned about through programs. I recognise them because I once lived a life riddled by them, and I still have to check myself every once in a while to make sure I'm not slipping back into bad habits. One thinking error is the should and must. People should stop playing loud music after 8 p.m. Fair enough. But why? First off, why 8 p.m? Second, what is loud music? I.e., what is the precise decibel level at which music is classed as loud? Third, is the music only loud if it's by an artist you don't like? People should be respectful and have the courtesy to say hello when they walk past you. Why? Because you're a friendly, gregarious extrovert? The error here is thinking your beliefs and values are the correct ones and that everybody should agree with you. I was Mr. Should and Must before I came to prison. Friends, partners and work colleagues were all judged by my own standards and values, but there was much greater flexibility in how I applied those standards to myself. Yeah, that's right. When somebody didn't behave as they should, I invariably failed to deal with it. I wouldn't act assertively and try to communicate with them. I wouldn't try to understand their perspectives and motivations. I would internalise my frustration and label them as knowing exactly what they are doing. What a fucking clown I was. Perhaps the biggest should in prison relates to snitching. There's an old saying, snitches get stitches, that's bandied about on every wing and every prison. If you grass on somebody, expect to get yourself cut. I find it ironic that it's the lads that are up to no good that live by this mantra. They are the bullies who make life miserable for so many people. They are the clowns that hide something, like hooch or a mobile phone, in a communal area that brings the heat on a whole wing. But they insist that it's cons against screws and people can't snitch. I've seen an incident where two lads were sharing a cell where one of them had a mobile phone. When the security team found the phone, it ended up both lads got nicked and punished for it, because the guy who owned it wouldn't take responsibility, and the other guy was afraid to snitch on him. But now, given my insights, what would I do in that situation? Well, I'd have a chat with my padmate, as I've done in the past, and explain that I don't do anything dodgy and I've never had a nicking. If the lad wants to get up to mischief, that's his prerogative. He'll have to find another cell. If I found anything in my cell, it would be straight down the bog. And if security did find something in my cell, I'd hesitate not a jot as I pointed both hands and declared, "Him there, he's fucking Spartacus." And it's I did. I had a single cell for a lot of the time, but when I was padded up at the start of my sentence, there was the padmate I had gotten back into drugs. He was back on heroin. This was Walton in Liverpool. And I mean, he sat in the cell, he's smoking heroin, and he has tin foils stashed around the place and everything else. And I saw him stashing the heroin, and I just turned around and I said, "I'm telling you now, mate, you get that the fuck out of the cell. That's it, done now. And if you don't, I'm telling you, I'm going down the office, I'm bubbling you fucking up." Now, I got a lot of flack for that. But what I pointed out was, I didn't bubble him up, but I said I would. The simple fact of the matter is, he didn't really give a shit. He had a fixed term sentence. He was getting out. There was a day he was getting out, and that was it. For me, I'm a lifer on an indeterminate sentence, and if that had been found and attributed to me, all of a sudden my risk would increase, and I would have drug elements on my record, and I would have to do offending behavioural work around heroin and about dependencies. When it came to the parole board, when it came to me being paroled and released in the community, there would be support stuff in place around addiction and around preventing acquisition crimes and all sorts of other stuff to go with it. So I just couldn't afford it. I knew I had done wrong, and I knew I was doing a prison sentence, but I determined that I was going to do everything that I possibly could. And I think that's the last thing I will say on offending behavioural programs. The HRP program was absolutely incredible, but 5 months. They ran it twice a year, and there were 10 men on each course. So that was 20 people a year who could get on that program. They ran the HRP program in about 5 prisons nationally at that time. So in total, there were 100 men each year who could start the Healthy Relationships program. There was about a 30% dropout rate, because there were guys who were just unmotivated, who were being forced to start the program, who would maybe do 3 or 4 sessions and then would just refuse to do it and stay in this cell. At that point, they couldn't bring anybody else into the program, and that place had been lost. So each year, probably around 70 people had done the Healthy Relationships program. Now you think on the other side, and the averages that are out there, that each week 2 women are murdered by partners or ex-partners. So there are 100 men coming into prison each year who have are convicted of murdering their partners or the manslaughter of their partners. Yet there are only 70 people completing these programs. That does not go without the tens of thousands of men who are committing brutal assaults, coercive and controlling behaviours, emotional abuse, sexual and financial abuse on their partners, and tens of thousands of them are coming into prison, and there are 70 courses each week. So this is why my blog and my podcast, why I've done this. I can't undo my crime. I've accepted that. But I won't accept that I can do no good. So for me, as I said at the end of that first vlog, the lessons I've learned come at too high a price to not be shared. And it's my ambition and my desire to share my experiences, to take responsibility, to speak candidly and forensically about my experiences, in the hope that I can prevent some violence from taking part in the future. And I had one of the guys I was speaking to in prison, he said it'd be great because you could stop somebody coming into prison. I said, well, more than that, my ambition is to stop somebody being hurt. Because if somebody's coming into prison, and these are the guys I saw, and I would share my experience, and I did help some guys start down the road of changing their beliefs, and some of them really did. You could see the point. You can see the sincerity in some people when the realization, the enormity of what they've done lands on them. And that was rewarding for me. However, there was already a victim out there by the time I had met that person. So for me, I want to speak to people before the offence has taken place, to make people realize that you are in an abusive relationship, you are perpetrating or you are the victim of abusive behaviours, because a lot of the times it was both parties could rationalise those behaviours. I witnessed the tension between my parents, the toxicity in that relationship, and it was something that I recreated. I've had healthy relationships and I've had abusive relationships, and I've realised that when I met somebody who also had an abusive relationship or abusive parents, that was when the chemical mix would become volatile. When I was with somebody who had been a stable and loving relationship or had stable parents and a normal upbringing, well, I don't know what you call normal, I would have a healthy and balanced relationship with that person. And this is the key difference. But it's very difficult to get a platform. And this is where the podcast is coming from. I've written to Layla Moran, the Lib Dem MP. I've written to Jess Phillips, who was the domestic abuse shadow minister at the time. Laura Bates. I've written to a number of charities, and to put myself out there to speak and share my experiences, because I do believe in the first instance it's about education. And this is where, think about obesity and think about the efforts that have been put in now to prevent it. And that's the way it needs to be, that domestic violence needs to be looked at as a pathology just as much as obesity or smoking or alcoholism and education. The NHS have two ways of dealing with obesity in the government. They can wait till people get fat and give everybody a gastric band, or they can educate people in how to eat more appropriately. Now, prison is what we're doing now at the moment. We're putting gastric bands on people, but we already have the damage being done out there. Really what we need to do now is to educate and prevent future victims and prevent the crime from happening, prevent the perpetrators. Talking about the pressure that's on prison systems at the moment, if you take 10% of the domestic abuse out of that system, 10% of the domestic abuse, I would love to know what that would measure. If you think about the amount of time that's involved with the police, with social services, with the judicial system, with the prison system, with rehabilitative work, with refuges, with supporting the victims of domestic violence. I mean, if we can stop 1% of that, if we can save one life, genuinely that has to be worth something. So that's where my motivation for this podcast, for the blog, has been. I knew this is where it was going to be heading to, and I will persevere. Ideally, I would like to remain anonymous, and that may not be possible. Quite a few people do know who I am. They know the Jailhouse Moose. They've met me through prison. I've had education staff and prison officers and everyone else who know who I am. So at some point I may be outed. I had paused the podcast. I was in a relationship briefly, and the reality of it was, if that person's family or work colleagues found out about it, how would it impact on them? If they found out that the person they were dating was a convicted murderer. That person had children, so what would happen in the playground if the children's friends found out about it, would they get bullied and would they get targeted because of my offence? So I had stopped the podcast because it wasn't conducive to having a relationship. But the relationship ended. There were too many other external pressures, and that is something I will speak about. It's kind of current now, and I didn't mean to speak about it, but it's very current right now at the moment. But I think this is what's given me the momentum to get back on and to do this podcast, and if I do get out, it so be it. I think I'm in a unique position to speak to my offence and to speak to the errors that are seeing so many people hurt out there, and if I can shine a light on it, well then, what sort of a prick would I be if I murdered somebody and I didn't do everything I could to prevent harm to somebody else? I really don't think I have a choice in the matter. And on that note, I'm going to finish for here. You will be able to reach me. It's Twitter or x.com/@jailhousemoose. You can get the blog itself is www.jailhousemoose.wordpress.com. If you search Jailhouse Moose in Google, you'll probably find it. And the other thing you can do is email me, jailhousemoose@gmail.com. I'll crack on with another podcast. I think this one's been quite somber. I think I might do something a little more lighthearted, a little more anecdotal next time. But until then, thank you for listening, and please reach out. Bye bye.